Welcome everyone to this presentation on Smith's Weekly and the larrikin tradition in Australian cartoon humour. Smith's being one of the main dominant publications in the 20th century tradition of Australian black and white art. And there on the left you'll see images of several of the cartoonists. Now, a warning before we get going: a lot of what I'm about to show you is racist, sexist, and in many other respects revolting by present standards. We're diving into white blokish Australia of the early 20th century. It's definitely white Australia, and what that blokish world found funny. There's a lot I find offensive, and you may wish to turn away now if you're likely to be enraged. So this is a general warning, and I will try not to badger on about it too much as we go through image by image. The stuff is there, and we've got to look at what we have in front of us. I encourage you to pause the presentation to look more closely at the cartoons and get a rest from me rabbiting on from time to time. So welcome. And here the contested term is clearly larrikin. It's a word that is popularly available as recently as today, Sunday Mail indeed, in a far better than usual article by Mark Mills, which I presume went through at least several of the News Corp tabloids. It's a central term in the popular mind, but it stopped being used in academic circles towards the end of the 1990s. I think probably largely as an early sign of the Howard era culture wars. And maybe we can get past that. That's sort of what I'm hoping. Now, another apology. If you saw my paper last year in Griffith, that was a finished paper. If you didn't like it, it was my work. It was my finished work you didn't like, and that's fine. I'm happy to be disagreed with. This is much more preliminary. I haven't had done the archive time yet to really be sure that what I'm seeing here is representative of, after all, 3 decades worth of weekly newspaper. The thesis here that I'm testing for the first time is that we need the word larrikin, but we also need a more plural sense of the different humour styles to describe both this newspaper and indeed national humour styles. That we can talk about Australian humour as long as we're not too exclusive in the way we do it. So let's start with my favourite cultural theorist or cultural historian on this period, Peter Kirkpatrick, who's written quite the best book on this since in 1992. And he talks about cartooning, and here he's talking initially, early on in the book, about the Bushman myth of the Bulletin in the 1890s. So this nationalist legend, Australian nationalist legend of the 90s, also ignored the early Bulletin's own cosmopolitanism. The Bushman's Bible was far from being the narrow parochial journal which that term might imply, and I think this is also broadly true of Smith's. I think we create a cartoon version of these newspapers, but by attaching them to the Bushman myth, to the larrikin. We also need a bunch of other terms: cosmopolitan, chauvinist, even moralistic, certainly bohemian, bourgeois, and that whole business of the respectability rhetoric that echoed through the middle of the 20th century. So Smith's cartoonists displayed irreverent Australian humour in a range of ways that can be described historically and not entirely prescriptively. That's the basic thesis. The paper started right at the end of World War I. Well, very shortly after, March 1st, 1919, and this cartoon about the Spanish influenza was there in the very first edition. I've been using it a lot recently. So the young lady, the older man, well, we don't have to wear masks here on the beach, but I must keep 6 feet away from you. And the young lady, thank goodness, about the 6 feet, no doubt. It's sort of a joke that still works. So there we are in the wake of World War I, and Smith was very attached to the fate of the servicemen of World War I. It's in the shadow of the Bulletin, which had risen to fame in the 1890s, and the Turner Federation was now becoming the established weekly. It was more a literary magazine. Smith's was more a weekly newspaper, or sensationalist. So we're at the dawn of the Roaring Twenties, and Smith then went through 3 very different decades, it seems to me. And this is a very Sydney story, like much Australian media history, something which we hope to problematise in the big cartoon project. So that's one image from the first edition. Here's another that feeds particularly into, that gives a sense of the time. That's Billy Hughes doing his imitation of peaceful intervention in the peace, in the Versailles peace convention. So he's breaking up the room on his horse, and Smith was very keen on horses, especially horse racing. And there's Woodrow Wilson, Maréchal Foch, Clemenceau, and David Lloyd George being messed with by the wild colonial boy. So 3 distinct decades. Smith was populist, national in distribution. It was a broadsheet, very busy in appearance by modern day standards, lots of text and lots of images and lots of advertisements on each page, but actually fairly modern for the period. It didn't, for example, have the deadeningly dull look of the Sydney Morning Herald, whose front page still in the sun right through this period was made up entirely of classified advertisements. The money was put up by the slightly larrikin himself, Sir James Joynton Smith, Lord Mayor of Sydney and former publican in various places, including New Zealand. And the 2 most famous runners of the paper were Claude Mackay, the editor, and Clyde Packer, who went on in various ways to form a dynasty that is still almost with us, although now in gambling rather than media. It was a more or less instant success. It was very prosperous very soon, and the cartoonists were exceedingly well paid. Cartoonists have never been better paid in Australia, it seems to me, apart from perhaps a brief period in the 70s. It travelled with the Federated Nations through 3 decades. It was especially associated with returned soldiers. And here's another thing I think is important. It focused at least as much on city life as on the bush. Now, the staff themselves had a legendarily hard drinking culture. That was part of the story. There's George Blakey, who was journalist at the newspaper throughout the 30s and 40s. He described the paper as irreverent towards established ways of life that savoured even faintly of pomposity. It was critical, raspberry firing, fast punching, and capable of smelling a sacred cow from afar off against the wind, and it then kicked the sacred cows. More synoptically, perhaps, Vane Lindsay, the cartoonist and cartoon historian, still with us at the age of 102, explained in 1970 that Smith's was blatantly jingoistic. A lot of this was reflected in its humour. This humour was in turn a reflection of the vernacular attitudes of the times. The themes of Smith's weekly humour never varied: humour about sex, not sexy humour, drinking and drunks, soldier humour, horse racing humour, Dad and Dave, rural humour, and a new departure in Australian urban humour, the theme of divorce. This was the dinky dice slang and the chauvinism totalled up to a fairly correct picture of Australian life, thought and attitude between the wars. And that's Lindsay's assertion, but it's a not indefensible one. So now I'm going to illustrate those themes fairly promptly, I hope. The Diggers champion on the left, here we've got Cecil Hart again, who was the first had particular control of the digger humour. So that's from very early on, in the May of 1919. And on the right, Frank Dunn took over that dominant gig when Hart, who was a returned World War I veteran, topped himself. So there was grief, there was trauma that they were working with and through and for. And here is an image very much conditioned by a sense of World War I trench warfare. What are we fighting for anyhow? A place in the sun. And I think there's a lovely rich pun in that, the place in the sun being back home in Australia. It's one of these sort of more schematic ways of reading that. And there are probably thousands, certainly hundreds, but I think probably thousands of images of soldiers, soldier humour here. And there was rural humour, but there was also a new, for the period, urban humour, based very much in Sydney's flat life and in Sydney's business world. And you can see that in the Russell image on the left there, along with the casual sexism, but this is moving into office life, the white collar humour, whereas on the right you've got a classic Dad and Dave type joke, which they certainly had plenty of. I can't substantiate them more urban than rural yet, but I think it's probable, and it certainly marks a contrast with the Bulletin, which hung on to the rural image of Australia much longer. And really during the period of Smith became a more conservative and less important journal, although still very important. So the urban-rural divide, which is an interesting thing in Australia given that we are so urban now. Other topics, the great 20th century topic of bureaucracy. I think that George Finey there is particularly fine, with those strange bureaucratic men coming out of their teapots from the civil service. In the sense the ordinary man in the street is speared by their pens. Or on the right by Joe Johnson, the marriage theme. Your daughter doesn't want to leave her mother. That's an idea, says the father. Take her too. So that the sort of mother-in-law type jokes. It also became, but that's not all that you find, because one of the interesting things is that there were at least a couple of female cartoonists in this very blokey environment. Persistently for decades, Molly Horseman and Joan Morrison, in particular, they were the major ones, and that's about as many female cartoonists as we've ever had, or indeed we still have. I'm wearing my Judy Horacek Roost Across the Road T-shirt as a sort of talisman of the need for more female cartoonists. And Smith's wasn't any worse than anybody else, let's put it that way. And sure, you've got the male gaze on the left with the Horsemen, but the men are ridiculed at least as much, more than the rather beautiful Art Deco female, and definitely there in Morrison, what you're beginning to get is a sense of female agency. Yes, within patriarchy, yes, within sexism. But what's your opinion of a girl who marries for money? Not much. She should be able to get it out of him without going that far. Limited forms of agency, limited subversions of the male gaze, but not nothing. And this applies also to one of the more famous and I think more obviously urban of the cartoonists, Virgil Riley, who tends to get left out of the larrikin, the accounts of the larrikin tradition, because his work doesn't fit. But it's certainly there in the paper, it's a dominant presence, and the Virgil girls were definitely very popular. And yeah, sure, this is male gaze and sexist, but it's also funny, it's also witty, and the women speak. They're not just bodies. There's a bohemian sophistication about this, at least. And I love this particular joke, not least because it's so beautifully drawn, but also the words. What are you doing? What are you doing this weekend? Oh, nothing to speak of. I thought you'd given up that sort of thing. Yeah, for the year of COVID, how is that for a joke or just a description of how we lived and perhaps are still living? So, and the cartoonists routinely worked with ideas that they illustrated in this period. That was the basic method, or they were welcome to think up their own ideas, but there was also, the people who sent in ideas were also rewarded for ones that they used. So bohemian sophistication in a populist journal, and you can certainly see that in a long series that they ran, at least 49 units in the book publication version of it, Darlinghurst Nights, which was a collaboration between Virgil Riley and the journalist and poet Kenneth Slessor, and who was for some time the editor of the paper, and he was certainly the dominant journalist throughout its history. Best known for his modernist poems such as The Great Five Bells, but here writing occasional verse of some wit and humour to attach to the rather beautifully conceived city and the rather very much the modernist Art Deco world of this garden in the sky. This is very much an apartment-based life rather than quarter-acre blocks, let alone farm blocks. And the poetic references, sure, this is popular verse, but the poetic references are not to bush ballads, they're to symbolists. There we go. The ghost of Mr. Villon still inhabits single rooms. That's the French modernist, the French symbolist, André Villon. And this is a lot more urban, at least, than Patterson or Henry Lawson. And this leads to Stan Cross, the most famous of the cartoonists here. And here's an example of a reprehensible cartoon, perhaps. The purest vein of Australian humour, according to Blakey, developed by Smith, was probably the Jackie-type gag, of which Stan Cross was the undisputed master. Stan not only devised the merriest, and I apologise, abo jokes, never a cruel one from Stan, but presented them with an artistry that is still quite breathtaking. And I ask you to entertain this possibility that it is at least worth thinking, if your things are already using stereotypes, whether cruelty or the lack or the presence of cruelty is an important thing. And it's worth saying in Smith's defence that after a routinely anti-Semitic start, its images of Jews became really quite supportive and quite strongly supportive as a consequence of Hitler. Anyway, I'm not really defending that, I'm describing it, and do note the skill in the presentation as well. Now here's the most famous cartoon, and here we're getting back to the central larrikin myth. Stop laughing, for gore's sake, stop laughing, this is serious. This famous cartoon is the dominant myth, potentially obscures the complexities of the things that I'm beginning to see in the previous slides. It allegedly from the 29th of July 1933, but Lindsay Foyle and I have spent the weekend trying to find out where it was, because it's not there for that date on Trove, so we're wondering when in fact it was first published. So to conclude, back to Peter Fitzpatrick's summary of the frame's intentions, and here is where he talks specifically about Smith, and what he says is certainly very formative for what I'm thinking anyway. The paper was directed at an average reader who was white, male, middle class, in values if not in fact, and so never attempted to question its intended audience's cultural assumptions, celebrated them, helped compound them. And that's true. It's popular media, that's what popular media does. It's not particularly exploratory. It's passionately egalitarian and passionately racist. It mocked the English upper class but warmly welcomed royalty to the extent that it was defined by the old bugbears that stood against communist Asian, Southern Europeans, so-called bad Jews. Smith's larrikinism was as much a negative thing, a Philistine defensive posture, as an affirmative national ideology. And there is nearly always a national humour style that operates as a Philistine defensive posture, is there not? And here I think most interestingly, this is all on page 116, Peter goes on to say, as it was at the forefront of change, Smith emerges as the most representative local journal of the 20s. Arguments about representativeness are always fraught, I know, but I think I agree with this one. Wit, outrageousness, political conservatism, the conservatism is very real, and self-justified belief in free enterprise makes Smith's definitive for a whole phase of our 20th century culture. In fact, the paper became a legend because, like the Bulletin in the 1890s, it was in the business of myth-making. It was making its own myths from the very beginning. So just for conclusions, plenty to chew on in that summary. The history of Smiths cannot be a simple celebration. It engages in myths that have had real cultural and political consequences, still echoing today, and those myths are not by any means all good. I also wonder how nationally definitive, so Sydney-based a story can be, so this is only a provisional assessment. What I think we have, what I'm beginning to see therefore, is graphic humour informed by beer-soaked and blokey white Australian larrikinism, as well as an internationalist bohemianism and a populist politics of respectability. Slightly raucous respectability, but respectability nonetheless. Bohemianism, the respectability, the larrikinism, all different threads. So larrikin, I think, is a real but partial and contestable descriptor. You can't use it as an umbrella term. Once you do that, you've got problems. And I think that's one of the things that went wrong in the sort of 70s and 80s, and why people stopped talking about national humour styles in the 90s. It was assumed that it had to be distinctive and exclusive of alternatives. If you're going to talk about Australian humour, and certainly the wider public expects us to be able to do so, we need a more plural sense of its manifestations. Avoid stigmatising any particular thread as un-Australian, even the ones we don't like. But a plural exploration of tensions and characteristics in the nation's humour seems very much worth the trouble, not least because it feels a wee bit dangerous in this era of daft culture wars. Thank you.